Welcome to the Shia Research Institute Inside Interviews. Today, we are so pleased to have an author with us. Dr. Nebil Husayn is an associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Miami. He's a specialist in the field of Islamic studies. His research explores authoritarianism in the Middle East, debates on the caliphate, and the development of Islamic thought. Dr. Husayn began his work as an undergraduate at the University of Virginia, where he studied Arabic, Persian, Islamic history, and Muslim cultures, before pursuing study abroad in Syria and Yemen for 4 years. During this time abroad, he pursued a seminary education with traditionally trained Sunni and Shi'i scholars. Dr. Husayn returned to the United States to obtain an MA in Arabic and Islamic studies from Harvard University and a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University. He is the recipient of a Fulbright Award and the University of Miami Fellowship in the Arts and Humanities. The family of the Prophet Muhammad and the fourth Caliph, Ali, and their descendants occupy a central place in his research. And today we're here to discuss Dr. Husayn's first book, Opposing the Imam, published in 2021 with Cambridge University Press. This book examines the history of early Muslims who were hostile to Islam's fourth Caliph, Ali, and his descendants. Husayn aims to continue interrogating the intellectual and political histories of this family in his future work. Dr. Husayn, thank you for joining us for this interview and discussion and discourse regarding your important research and this recently published book.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's get right into it. You know, I for years have been reading Marshall Hodgson, as I'm sure you have. And somehow, although he wrote this book, 60 years ago or so, the book is still relevant in so many ways. And he has such poignant descriptions of Islamic history, or in his interpretation of the past. So I want us to open with, I'm going to read to you a quote from Hodgson's first volume, which I think is very relevant to your research, and maybe have you kind of think about it or discuss what it means to you. Hodgson says, in launching the venture of Islam, the events of the first generation after Muhammad were almost as formative as those of Muhammad's own time. It is not accidental that later Muslims have identified themselves in terms of these events and the factions that grew out of them. They have interpreted the whole history in symbolism derived from them and have made the interpretation of those events and the leading personalities in them the very test of religious allegiance. This has confused the factual historical picture, but at the same time, it has highlighted the points at which we must see the events of the time as crucial in the development of Muslim religious awareness. I really like this quote and just thought I would share it with you and get your thoughts.
Sure. So when I think about Islamic history, that's very different from the question of Islamic historical writing, meaning history versus historiography. And very early on in my book, I try to consider the question of, well, how are people going to receive my book if I am talking about early Islamic history? But at the same time, once you ask the question about authenticity and historicity and accuracy, there's a question of how do these portrayals represent reality? And it becomes a question of historical writing. What are your sources, and how are you obtaining this information? And I'd say Muslims in general have been very much fixated on this question of what's right and what's wrong, and what can we trust and what can we not, who can we trust and whom can we not. And then once we get to the question of academic studies of Islamic history, again, there's a spectrum of how people understand our historical sources. There are those who are optimistic in saying that the way in which Muslims remember the past can represent kernels of truth. And then there are those who are, you could say, hyper-skeptical. And so recently, Najm Haider has actually written a book called The Rebel and Imam, in which he looks at this question of historiography. How is it that 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th century Arabs remembered the past, and then how did they begin writing about it? And I'd say when I read these texts, I don't look at it as a straight litany of historical facts. Rather, okay, there's Ṭabarī, but then Ṭabarī is relying on a previous generation of what we call historians, but I would say it's better to call them storytellers. And in fact, I'd say they're closer to screenwriters. And so we're talking about the generation of Madaini, Sayf ibn Omar, Abu Mikhnaf, Ibn Ishaq. All these guys are storytellers, and they were good storytellers. And the audience understood that when you are in the presence of a storyteller or a screenwriter, even if they're talking about the past, the best ones dramatized events in certain ways. So they understood these storytellers or these screenwriters to have historical, to have artistic license, right? A rhetorical license in the way that they would use their own words. They'd add dialogue. They'd provide greater details on what these characters are arguing about. So again, in Sunni Shia historiography, let's say it's a argument or conversation between the first caliph Abu Bakr and the family of the Prophet about something, or Omar and the family of the Prophet, or during Ali's caliphate, Ali versus Muawiyah, when they're going back and forth in debates. The audience understood that the screenwriter is basically being faithful to history, in that he's not going to tell you an outcome that didn't happen. So at the end of the Battle of Jamal, or the Battle of the Camel, it's Ali's army that's going to win. He's not going to change those facts. But the way that he tells the story, it depended on what masjid you were going to or what circle you were visiting to see their strategy of literary embellishment, the interpretive frameworks that they're doing to give the story meaning, who's the villain, who's the hero, and what is the lesson that we're going to get out of this? What's the moral lesson? And so for Shi'is, Ali is the hero. He's this wise hero, not just Shi'is, but pro-Alids at that time. And so when you read the story, it's this tragic underdog who is always facing a community that is rebellious, that is disobedient, and you see him use his wisdom, his patience to deal with that intransience that he faces from his peers. And so when I think of that quote from Hodgson, I think of this idea that really our sources are ones in which you have great storytellers who collect facts and then eloquently and persuasively give you their take when they redefine it and retell the story as one that's either pro-Umayyad, pro-Uthmani, or pro-Ali.
Yeah, and it also kind of reminds me of al-Hibri's book on the Rashidun, published by Columbia University some years ago, right? I think he also kind of, while writing about this concept of al-Khulafa Rashidun, it's not a book of history per se. It's more looking at as a form of literature, and the literature within it has there's certain motivations to present literature in a certain way, right? And if I'm not correct, I think you're approaching the sources in a similar way in your book, as far as I remember from the introduction.
Right. Yeah. So it's very early in the introduction that I say, look, I'm not going to engage in these debates on how accurate and how historical Muslim narratives are of the past. What I want to do is collectively look at the literature, that this literary legacy that we have, and understand how these different sub-communities told these stories. And al-Hibri does that with his book Parable and Politics, where he's looking at the ways in which the Rashidun conformed to biblical motifs about heroes, villains, prophets, men of God, and so on. And when you get to his comments on Imam Ali and the family of the Prophet, I think some of those comments are really on point, that he represented this tragic hero that even our Sunni sources subtly, or that's like the implicit line of portraying Imam Ali in this way as someone who could have been caliph, who's representative of the Hashemite claim to it, but he's continuously passed over by these other predecessors and so on. And when he finally becomes caliph, there is the civil war, but again, he's this tragic hero that's engulfed by people around him who don't seem to recognize his stature.
Yeah, excellent, wonderful. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you came to the subject on early Alid history and their opponents? Just maybe briefly, kind of how you stumbled on this subject and then decided to write a whole book about it.
Sure. So I think when it comes to early Islamic history, the big discovery that I made is that, you had someone of the stature of Imam Ali, who is this revered saint across, many different communities in Islam. But when you look into history, he was once hated by thousands of Muslims. And so this discovery was one that led me to ask why. Why was this the case? Why did Muslims believe these negative portrayals of him? How did Muslims who loved him respond to these negative portrayals? Didn't the Prophet speak favorably about him? And so I wanted to dig and excavate the beliefs and the arguments of this opposition to Ali that apparently was quite hostile to him. I was very curious about that fact. And I think another unique thing about studying the opposition to him is that usually you have representatives of multiple different schools and doctrines that are enduring. And what I learned when you study fiqh literature or these works on heresiographies is that there doesn't seem to be a chapter on the Nawāṣib as this separate sect. It's like they're almost written out of history. They're forgotten. And that's a consequence of them not being enduring, I believe, that you don't have this sect that best represents their views today. And so I wanted to look at this early social, political, theological group of people or persuasion of Muslims and write this monograph that tries to interrogate and fully excavate their views.
Thanks. Yeah, and it certainly is a wonderful monograph. I read it and I was really intrigued. Definitely.
Thank you.
So let's get right into it. Who are the Nawāṣib?
So if I could briefly point to Nawāṣib in, let's say, the first and second centuries after the Prophet's death, I'd say you'd find them among those who were zealous supporters of the first three caliphs. And so the word in Arabic that people used to refer to that group is the Uthmaniyya. It's again a phrase that we don't really use anymore. But the Uthmaniyya were people who believed that Abu Bakr, Omar, and Uthman were legitimately elected and that they were the best of the community. And they viewed the fourth caliph, Imam Ali, with hostility. And so they didn't, today we have this belief in the Khulafa Rashidin that is made up of at least four caliphs, and that's common within the Sunni community. But before that, there was a preceding doctrine that the Khulafa Rashidin were three. And this was a view held apparently by some companions and the generation after them, and then a few generations afterwards, that the best of the community were Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and then there was this civil strife, this sedition that occurred in which there wasn't a caliph. And so Uthmanis have you could call a quietist and an activist wing to it. The family of Umar bin Khattab was representative of this quietist wing where they didn't go into politics after the death of Uthman. They mostly turned to legal and theological discourses or the intellectual tradition. And then you have an activist wing, which I would say was made up of the family of the Zubayrids. They actually established a caliphate in Mecca, and the Zubayrids were tied to the family of Abu Bakr as well. And so, they lead the family these two wings lead the insurrection at the Battle of the Camel, but then 20 years later, they also rebel against Yazid. And so this activist and quietist wing believed, you could call them pro-three caliphs, or they were Uthmani in their perspective of, in terms of the executive, legislative, spiritual authority after the Prophet. It went to Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, and the partisans of these three. And so you could say Sunnism benefits from this Uthmani legacy because Sunnism incorporates that, in addition to incorporating pro-Alid sentiment that existed in the Muslim community, meaning those who revered the family of Ali and also looked to him and that family as authority figures. So I would say the first group of Nawāṣib would be the Uthmaniyya, and if you were to define the Nawāṣib, it's those who held the family of Ali, held Ali and his family in contempt. They were outwardly hostile to him. And so that first group is the Uthmanis. The second group would be the Umayyads, or the family of Uthman. They were hostile to Imam Ali because they viewed him as benefiting from the murder of Uthman, and in fact culpable in Uthman's death, since those who protested and rebelled were either involved in his assassination or viewed him as someone who had committed misdeeds that required his removal from power. And when he refused to abdicate, that required a forceful removal. And so the Umayyads held anyone who protested against Uthman as responsible for his murder. And so that included Imam Ali, who viewed the grievances against the governors of Uthman as legitimate. And so there are many incidents that occurred, like, for example, Uthman's half-brother, Walid ibn Uqba, was the governor in Kufa, and he was found intoxicated and leading prayer and, misappropriating funds. And so even the had punishment, the flogging punishment, was administered on him because he was openly intoxicated in prayer and so on. And so when the Kufans rebelled against Uthman, they were saying, look, he has put people in power that aren't representative of Muslim norms, and that these were grievances that they held where his governors need to be removed. So because Ali ibn Abi Talib viewed these grievances as legitimate, the Umayyads later said, and then he became caliph after Uthman. He must have had something to do with his assassination. And so they were very strong in their opposition to him. And there are other reasons that people give, for example, tribalism, tribal rivalries, or within Shi'i historiography, it's that they actually knew he was the appointed imam, and so they just had contempt for the people of God, basically, or the representatives of God. So the second group would be the Umayyads. The third group, I would say, you can locate Nawāṣib among the Khawarij. So there are multiple Khariji schools that formed after the caliphate of Imam Ali. The Kharijis drew their inspiration from the Muhakkima, and the Muhakkima were soldiers in Ali's army that said La hukmu illa lillah after the arbitration incident at Siffin. And Ali ibn Abi Talib originally wanted to maintain a policy of, look, live and let live. If these individuals no longer want to support my army, perhaps we can debate them and convince them to come back. But if they refuse to help us in our struggles to establish sovereignty and peace and justice over the empire, then they can be left alone. But apparently, according to Sunni and Shia historiography, they became quite extreme in attacking and killing those who pledged allegiance to Ali and maintained their allegiance to Ali and didn't recognize that he had become an unbeliever. And so the Kharijites became extreme in viewing those who opposed their doctrine or disagreed with them as unbelievers. And this is a strain within different religious communities that we see outside of Islam and within Islam, that you take this absolutist approach. And so their absolutism led them to come to a different position from Uthmanis and Umayyads in saying that, yes, he was legitimately elected. He had been a caliph that all were required to pledge allegiance to, but he disqualified himself, and it became necessary to disavow oneself of his caliphate or of his authority, and in fact condemn him as a non-believer. So in short, the Nawāṣib are those who were Uthmani, meaning pro-3 caliphs who were opposed to Ali and his family, the Umayyads who blamed Ali and his family for the murder of Uthman, and the Khawarij who said he was legitimately elected, but then became misguided as caliph in his search for or reach for power.
Excellent, excellent. So I guess a question that just comes to mind here, which is, how would Imāmī scholars view those that fought Ali at Jamal, who then later on would become, would be revered companions of the Prophet, but on the other hand were fighting Ali at the Battle of the Camel? Would they be then classified under this as technically the earliest of the Nawāṣib, like the first, like the seedling of them?
Sure. Well, it's not just Imāmīs, but, pro-Alid Muʿtazalites had to think about this. Other groups had to think about, how do you make sense of senior companions who opposed Ali ibn Abi Talib? Because when these debates occurred of who was right and who was wrong in the first couple centuries, you had these multiple factions who were okay with saying our group represents the party of God and everybody else is misguided. And over time, there were ways in which people wished to reach some sort of compromise and negotiate these hard boundaries. So I would say early Imāmīs, if we're going to talk about, let's say, Shi'ism in the Umayyad period, may have been okay with condemning senior companions. And in fact, this is well known within Shi'ism that you have literature that this portrays Aisha, Talha, Zubayr, or even the first 3 caliphs as hypocrites, munafiqun, evil individuals who are very certain that Ali ibn Abi Talib is someone who has been selected by God as an imam, but even in that certainty are opposed to him. And Muawiyah is portrayed this way. And so Shia historiography has that element. It's a very sectarian one, and it's a very, you could say, simple one, where it's just like there's clearly those who are good and representative of God, and those are the imams, and then anyone who opposes him must be part of that camp. And so you can see how Shi'i writers, that early period, that's how they view the factionalism. And that's how Uthmanis, from the other side, viewed those who opposed the first 3 caliphs. That's how Umayyads viewed those who opposed Uthman and their monarchy. But after the 2nd and 3rd centuries, you have the proliferation among the Ahl al-Hadith of a doctrine known as ʿadālat al-ṣāḥāba, the righteousness of companions. And this forces them to now do 2 things. Either you reject those texts in which companions are behaving badly, breaking bad, or you interpret them in a way that allows individuals to safeguard their righteousness and say, look, they may have made a mistake, but God will forgive them because, their intentions were probably good since they were people who met the Prophet and so on. And so once that doctrine begins to proliferate within Sunnism, you see the ways in which it deals with that, according to the, in terms of these civil wars. Within Shi'ism, you could say that there is also a spectrum, but it's not necessarily due to ʿadālat al-ṣāḥāba, but rather because you have pro-Alids who may not have been Imāmī, but they were supportive of Ali's caliphate and imamate in different ways, who were affected by that doctrine and who may have tried to soften the situation of the leaders of the battle, the camel, in terms of their place in the hereafter. So you have pro-Alid, let's say, Baghdadi Mu'tazilis, were people who believed in Tafdeel Ali, those who believed that Ali was the best after the Prophet. And they believed that in terms of Talha and Zubayr, that they were, there's evidence that they were regretful and they asked for forgiveness for their deeds before they died. And they recognized that they were wrong. And that, for them, qualifies as a type of tawbah, so that these righteous senior people can be saved, whereas their soldiers may have been individuals who are not saved because they died on that path. And Aisha also has famous reports within the Sunni community in which she is, within Sunni literature, in which she is very regretful. And they interpret, and she weeps over her actions. And they interpret that as evidence that they were repented, that they repented of their deeds. Within Twelver Shi'ism, I mean, your question was specifically about Imāmīs. If they draw on some of that literature, you might have individuals who, in seeking some sort of compromise with those who are not Imāmī, will take a position that they may not have known what they were doing was wrong. And if they didn't know what they were doing was wrong, meaning they were certain that they were doing a good thing, then God will judge them based on the actions that they did. God will judge them not only on the actions, but on their intentions as well. So you might have Imāmīs that will say, if someone is, for example, non-Imāmī, this becomes a larger question of how does God judge those who are non-Imāmī? And you have those who've become more, in terms of salvation, more inclusive rather than exclusive. And those who are inclusive will say, these individuals were not Nawāṣib. Zubayr, for example, is not a Nāṣibī. There was a part of him that recognized that Ali was right, and then before he died, he recognized that he was wrong, and he stepped back from that. And they'll leave it to God to interpret those reports about that, and even other reports about Imam Ali saying, don't kill Zubayr, and there are hadith about that. And again, everyone plays with these hadith in different ways. On the Sunni side, it's like, don't kill him because he's from Ahl al-Jannah, and so anyone who kills him is from, will be punished. And from the Imāmī side, there are different ways in which that's polemically turned around, where it says, oh no, he's from the people of hellfire, and the person who kills him will also be from the people of hellfire, so don't be the person that kills him. So, I mean, there are ways in which people play with this, but there are those who are careful not to condemn, and they're saying, look, based on their beliefs, God, or in their intentions, God might forgive them, or give them an opportunity for salvation.
Thanks. That was a really comprehensive answer. It's wonderful. Let's discuss some of the source material that you used in your research. I do remember you mentioning the distinction between primary and secondary sources, as you understand those two concepts in your research. Can you tell us a little bit about the sources that you drew upon in putting together this research? Yeah.
Sure. So in terms of the way in which, the nuts and bolts that I engage in searches, really I benefit from databases that exist of Islamic intellectual history. So I have access to hundreds of thousands of volumes, and I can do a string search. I can look up Bughd Ali, contempt for Ali, or, La'ana in Aliyan or something like, or Sabba Ali, and I can find those individuals who engaged in these practices by doing a string search of Sunni hadith collections, biographical dictionaries, historical chronicles, maybe theological treatises in which people consider this history. For this project, I wanted this to be a discussion of Nasb and the family of the Prophet in non-Shi'i sources, but of course Shi'i sources are ones that I can browse, or as a reference, as a guide, like look at what are Shi'is arguing, and if there is a reference, a cross-reference that can be found in Sunni literature, then I sought the Sunni reference. I didn't want this to be simply a study of Shiism, because Shiism has many sources and claims about how early Muslims were Nawāṣib. Even if they don't use the word Nāṣibī, in their portrayal of early companions and Umayyads and Uthmanis as Nawāṣib, you get the argument throughout Shia literature that this is the case. This is the way in which you should view history, that there are those who are opposed to āLī because of their contempt for him. And rather than drawing on that, I wanted to see if Islamic intellectual tradition had that outside of Shiism. And so I focus on Ibadi sources, Mu'tazili sources, and Sunni sources to understand this question. And I do database searches to get that done. Now, in terms of your second question, how do we distinguish between, or how do I particularly distinguish between primary and secondary sources? In the first couple chapters, I'd argue that I'm dealing with secondary sources, meaning I'm using intermediaries to understand anti-ālids. And there, again, if we're talking about the question of historicity and accuracy, there's this question of, to what extent can second and third century sources describe to us the lay of the land in the first century after the Prophet's death? And so I would say a primary source, or the closest thing that we have to a primary source for anti-ālids, would be the writing of al-Jahid and those who people would point to as anti-ālid, and they are explaining why they reject veneration of Ali, or they're explaining why he, texts that exalt him should be doubted and should be questioned. And in fact, he occupies a lower station than what pro-ālids claim. And of course, Jahid is a difficult person to work with, because in one text he presents himself as if he's an anti-ālid, but in another, and in that text he will demolish Zaydi or Shi'i arguments for Tafdīl Ali. But then in another text he'll explain why, Tafdīl Ali would be a very persuasive argument if we argued it along these lines, as a Zaydi who doesn't rely on hadith, but a Zaydi who uses theological, or Baghdadi Mu'tazili who uses theological and logical arguments. He says it would be persuasive to view him as afdal, in terms of being most wise or most knowledgeable, most courageous, and he just goes down the litany of lists of how people came to that decision. And so for me, a primary source is when you're dealing with an anti-ālid or someone accused of anti-ālidism and they're writing it with their own pen, versus secondary sources, their riwayat, that these are intermediaries that are telling us someone acted this way, someone said these things, and it may be true, but that's a different set of historical claims.
So when you were looking at 3rd, 4th, 5th century historiographies or historical chronicles, or tarajum literature like Ansab al-Ashraf or Ibn Sa'd earlier, al-Ṭabarī, Mas'udi, Yaqubi, on and on and on, would you treat them more as secondary sources, the things you find in there that are speaking about the nasab or the nawasib of the past?
I do, and even if I had access directly to the writings of Abu Mikhnaf and Madaini and earlier storytellers, right, I would say these chroniclers like Ṭabarī are relying on early storytellers. So let's say I was in the masjid listening to Abu Mikhnaf or Madaini tell the story of what happened, and what I would understand them as screenwriters or storytellers is that they are giving their own 2 cents in the way that they dramatize the events. And I like the way this guy does it versus Sayf ibn Umar, who's doing it the other way. And so I would say this is secondary by nature, because I'm not there witnessing the events that they're talking about. And we get competing portrayals of how to understand those debates. For example, what happened after the Prophet's death in the debates that occurred between the first caliph and the Prophet's family. So these are all secondary sources for me, even if they give you their chain of transmission, even if Mada'ini, or once we go to hadith collections, they're telling you C heard from B, from A, from Ali ibn Abi Talib himself. These are still secondary sources.
They're secondary sources. Okay, interesting. Yeah, because they're relying essentially on their sources and reporting to us on the basis of their sources. And sometimes those sources are relying on sources that came before them, and it's just a chain and chain until you get to the end of it, and there's no holy grail at the end of it where you could just find that original archaeological source that just contains everything written at the time, like like someone observing World War II and has observed the battle and has recorded the details of the battle, and that original work has survived from that time, right? You're relying on reports upon reports upon reports going back.
But even if you had a report from an eyewitness, let's say you had a Nazi giving you his tale of events, and then you had a Japanese soldier giving you his tale, and you had a Russian soldier giving his tale, and you had a British soldier giving his perspective on what was going on. For me, it's that even if you had that eyewitness source, each of them are providing their own take on the matter in a way that villainizes people and valorizes others. And so I'm aware of that when I'm listening to a pro-Alid storyteller, if it's coming from Madani or Waqidi or Abu Mikhnaf. But sometimes, like Abu Mikhnaf is pretty good because he tells us he uses pro-Alids, but he also uses people who became Khawarij. He uses Umayyad in terms of giving us takes on what happened. And so I'm just hyper aware that even if we have an eyewitness source, they are representative of just one sliver of how people witnessed that event.
Excellent. Let's move on now. I want us to ruminate a little bit over the formation of what came to be known as Ahlus Sunnah wa Jama'ah, particularly with the inclusion of pro-Alid reports or pro-Alid sentiment in proto-Sunni literature, which would then become kind of proverbially known as Ahlus Sunnah wa Jama'ah. As we know, this is a much later concept that developed. Tell us a little bit about that. You do discuss it in the book about the presence of pro-Alid traditions in proto-Sunni literature and what that tells us about the shift away from this difficult and complex past, right? Let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I can pull up a slide for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead. That would be great.
All right. So can you see this slide locating Sunnism?
Yeah, I can. I can see the slide.
All right. Okay, great.
Excellent.
So yeah, if we were to take a snapshot of different allegiances that existed after the death of the Prophet, let's say in the first 2 centuries, you had those who were pro-Three Caliph, the Uthmaniyya that I mentioned, the Umayyads, those who were pro-Hashemid. And then you had, I would argue, a centrist movement in which you had ulama, you had scholars who argued that instead of the khulafa being the warathat al-anbiya, that it's the ulama who are warathat al-anbiya. Right? If before this period, every caliph claimed to be the Khalifatullah or Khalifatul Rasulullah, the deputies of God on earth. It's a very archaic way of viewing leadership after the death of the Prophet. In fact, Imāmī still maintain that archaic view that after the Prophet, these leaders were the leaders of everything in terms of executive, legislative, spiritual authority. Your salvation is in following these imams. And I would say that was a very archaic view that other Muslims held as well when they were pro-Three Caliph or pro-Umayyad or so on. And so these new, by the, let's say the turn of the end of the 2nd century, you had all of these ulama. You had hadith scholars, you had legal scholars, right? Going from Abu Hanifa to Shafi'i to Malik and Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and these individuals viewed themselves as inheriting the Prophet's authority in different ways in terms of knowing what the Sharia is, what were the teachings of the Prophet, and they didn't trust the claims of Umayyad or Abbasid caliphs having that knowledge and guiding the community, even though when the Umayyads were in power, they believed that they had that authority, or the Abbasids claimed to have that. And so with this new faction of centrists who said that the ulama were warathatul anbiya, in terms of their teachers may have been pro-Umayyad. Their teachers may have been pro-Alid or pro-Three Caliph, but they said, let's take this position of we can't judge what happened in the past, that we don't have enough certainty on who is right and who is wrong in terms of these civil wars, and that we'll leave it to God to decide who to punish and who to reward in the hereafter. I would say that that position of we don't know and we won't judge is associated with the Murji'ah, which was a group that you could say existed before the crystallization of Sunnism. And so Murji'i sentiment was something that existed before Sunni sentiment, which is representative of an even more radical optimism existed. And you could say that radical optimism evolved from this we cannot judge position. And so that radical optimism was one that says we might have our own theory on who is right and who is wrong, but we're going to maintain belief that God forgave everyone who was involved if they were a companion of the Prophet. And that, again, at the end of the 2nd century, is a consequence of ʿadālat al-ṣāḥāba, this belief that all companions are righteous. Let's stop the factionalism that existed among these pro-Three Caliphs, these Umayyads, and these pro-Hashemids. Everyone is basically condemning someone outside of that group. So if we're going to locate Sunnism, I would say we locate it in the middle, that is trying to forge this new position, but is also influenced by predecessors who left a legacy, a lasting legacy in terms of the hadith that they transmitted and the views that they upheld. So their teachers, so if you are a centrist scholar of the late 2nd and 3rd centuries, and so Bukhārī, for example, is in the middle of the 3rd century, he dies, or he's active in the first half of the 3rd century. You could say Bukhāri's informants before him are going to be pro-Three Caliph, pro-Hashemid, and pro-Umayyad individuals. Same thing with Ahmad ibn Hanbal. If he's active in the middle of the 3rd century, his informants before him may have been people who identified with one of these factions, especially if they were Shami. They're very likely to be pro-Umayyad or pro-Three Caliph. So Sunnism is evolving out of that. At the same time, Sunnism in Kufa and in Iraq had a pro-Alid legacy. So you had, let's say, Ibn Abi Shayba, when he's putting together his Musannaf, which is made up of thousands and thousands of hadith, he's going to use some pro-Alid informants to talk about the Fadā'il of Ali or the Caliphate of Ali, his legal views and so on. And so those informants narrate hadith about his merits. And so you get some of that in the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba. When Ahmad ibn Hanbal comes to the decision that Ali is the 4th rightly guided caliph, and that only holding 3 would be a type of heresy, then he makes the decision to take that Kufan pro-Alid legacy and narrate it and include it in his Musnad. But then he also writes a Fadā'il, or he may not have written it himself, but he narrates a collection about the Fadā'il of the Sahaba, and his extensive section on Ali ibn Abi Talib relies on this Kufan legacy of pro-Alids. And you have the chain of transmission, so you see who these figures are. Some of them are considered members of the Imāmī community. Some of them are considered members of a proto-Zaydi community that hasn't really crystallized perhaps at this time. And many are just part of this pro-Alid contingency. And I would call them individuals who revered Ali ibn Abi Talib, but didn't necessarily despise the first 3 caliphs or other groups. They were just members of the Muslim community who viewed themselves as not part of a smaller sub-community, but people who revered Ali, who had been part of his army, or their parents or grandparents had been part of his army, and they revered him and respected him as a legitimate caliph. And so when those individuals narrated merits of him, perhaps in other collections before this time, before ʿadālat al-ṣāḥāba became a norm, it was specific to Kufa and it was considered Shi'i, but once Ali is rehabilitated and considered, not a villain, but actually a legitimate caliph, or not someone engulfed in sedition and civil strife, but someone who represented, the Prophet and righteousness and justice, that pro-Alid legacy is incorporated within Sunni culture in different ways, or Sunni literature in different ways. So Ahmad ibn Hanbal, like I said, narrates hundreds of hadith from this. He's very helpful for us in preserving what it is that pro-Alids believed about Ali at this time. Again, being the 2nd century, and then you have people like an-Nasā'ī, who's drawing very much on the same type of literature. You're not going to see much difference between what is in Ahmad ibn Hanbal's Fudāl Amir al-Mu'mineen and what's in Nasā'ī's Khasās Amir al-Mu'mineen. Very much similar. And then from there are people who might be more circumspect in how much they include. So Muslim's Sahih or Bukhāri's Sahih collection or other collections might include just a fraction of that, because they're looking at those narrators who were universally apparently approved by their peers versus those who were simply pro-Alid. And so if you were engaged in that factionalism, you may have been critiqued and condemned for one reason or another. Ahmad ibn Hanbal is more accepting of those individuals. He has a different methodology than let's say, someone like Bukhari. But so Sunnism is one where when you look at its literature, it's going to have all of these different factions in it. It might be someone who's centrist, someone who's pro-Alid, pro-Hashemid, pro-Three Caliph, Umayyad, and it's somewhere there. Versus Shi'ism, the sentiments you have are those who consider themselves partisans of Ali and his family. And so when you read Shi'i literature, your sources are generally going to be individuals who self-identified as such.
Excellent. You can keep this slide on if you want, or you can
Sure.
Go back to full screen.
Yeah.
You mentioned Bukhari and Muslim. What kind of censorship? So now moving away from this Nawāṣib, from this or this trying to kind of put to bed this Nāṣibī heritage of the past, you have Bukhari and Muslim putting together there, which would become the most important compilations of hadith for Sunnism. What kind of selectivity did they engage in, or censorship perhaps? There's only so much Alid material you could include. So I guess there's two questions. One, there's a clear move away from nasab. There's definitely a clear move away from this, a kind of taqrib, if you want to, I don't know, from a Sunni angle, let's bring people together.
Yeah.
But that had limits, didn't it? That had limits as to how far you could go. Where did Bukhari and Muslim stand? If you could, I know it's a very big, long-winded question, but maybe just very briefly tell us a little bit about Bukhari and Muslim and the inclusion of pro-Alid reports in there, because that was not as simple as it seems, is it?
Sure. So their objectives in their collections was one in which Bukhari and Muslim sought to articulate orthopraxy and a little bit of orthodoxy, right? So they want to present a collection of hadith in which jurists could trust that the legal positions that they were putting forth, the precedents that they were putting forth, were representative of the Prophet through a chain of transmission of reliable narrators. And in some places, they also talk about the beliefs of the Prophet, but I would say that's a secondary thing. It was mostly, what did he say and do that Muslims can reliably understand as part of their own legal practice of rituals and so on. So their objective is not to collect and present for example, everything that the community remembered about the merits of the Sahaba, the companions. Their section on the merits of companions and the beliefs that Muslims had about them are comparably short. In Ahmad ibn Hanbal's Fadāil al-Sahaba is I would say, more representative of that literature. It tells us how, let's say, this proto-Sunni, and or I should be more particular, how pro-Umayyads, Uthmanis, and pro-Alids remembered these famous caliphs and revered them, how they exalted them. So it's two different, you could say, objectives. And when Ahmad ibn Hanbal has his collection and Muslim and Bukhari have theirs. And so I think sometimes the critique is misplaced when Shiis or pro-Alids say, Bukhari is intentionally excluding these reports. Well, his goal wasn't really to present to you everything that he had heard. And there are times in which his own subjectivities are clear as well, that he is skeptical of a lot of this literature exalting Ali. That was his own personal perspective, I think. And so in terms of the project that they had, in general, as Sunnis, you could say there was a project in which there were scholars who were anti-Shi'i, and so they sought to suppress and condemn not only Shi'i reports as inaccurate, but also Nāṣibī reports as inaccurate too. And so it became heresy to curse Ali ibn Abi Talib or accuse him of sinfulness. And so they sought to discredit most of those reports. But it also became their objective to discredit any whiff of Shi'ism. And so that includes those texts portraying Ali as superior to his predecessors or noting disagreements with him. And so from their perspective, if I'm going to talk about their subjective views, they viewed him as a companion who was liable to mistakes, just like any other companion. And so sometimes they narrate reports that show that. And I'd argue it may have been unintentional, but they are narrating what may have been Nāṣibī reports, in which the source or the core of it were coming from Umayyads or Uthmanis who sought to slander Ali ibn Abi Talib or diminish his standing in the community. But for later scholars like Bukhari, it seemed like there was a legitimate, or there was a reliable chain of transmission, so they narrated it.
Would you say a similar editorial lens would have been applied to the certain traditions or the way Hasan and Husayn were presented as well?
In Sunni literature?
Yeah, and particularly in Bukhari and Muslim.
Right. So the takeaway that I have when I read about al-Hasan and Husayn in Bukhari's text is that they forever remain children and infants, till the end of their lives. Like that's on. They're frozen in time as children who would jump on the Prophet's back, and that's it. They never became adults. They never had a political career, and we don't really learn about. There's only one report in Bukhari in which, and it's an amazing one because it's a pro-Alid one, where Hassan ibn Ali and Ammar ibn Yasir are in Kufa encouraging the Kufans to rise up and join Imam Ali's army to fight Aisha at the Battle of the Camel, or Aisha's insurrection, or her army. And that's ostensibly pro-Alid report, because in it Ammar is saying, look, we understand she's the wife of the Prophet, but you have a choice between obeying God or obeying her. So it's giving you this demarcation between obedience to God and obedience to this respected widow of the Prophet, and Bukhari includes that report. And it's both Hassan and Ammar who are there. And in fact, Ammar stands on a step. Bukhari includes this it's part of the original report, but he doesn't censor it. Ammar stands on a step below Hassan ibn Ali, because Hassan ibn Ali is Sibt Rasulullah. He's the grandson of the Prophet, and you see how even a senior companion is revering the grandson of the Prophet who's younger than him, and so on. So I would say the objectives and aims of this literature is one that's different. And okay, why is it the case that Hasan and Husayn are generally frozen in time? It's because, again, their goals were to share with Muslims the repository of hadith that are reliable in terms of legal practice attributed to the Prophet. Before Bukhari and Muslim, if you were to pick up Malik's Muwatta, if you were to pick up the Musannaf of Abdur Razzaq, Harold Motsky is helpful in telling us this. The reports go to all of these different authorities in Islamic history. A fraction of those reports are attributed to the Prophet. We're looking at the Sunnah of Umar bin Khattab. We're looking at the Sunnah of Ahl al-Medina. We're looking at the Sunnah of a different caliph and the view of another companion on this matter, of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and so on and so on. And so only a fraction of it goes back to the Prophet. In Bukhari and Muslim, they're like, look, let's put aside all of those other authorities. We just want to know what the practice of the Prophet was. So they have a very particular agenda or goal, which is to give you the picture of the Prophet's life. And so in his lifetime, Hasan and Husayn remain kids.
Excellent. I want us to go to a passage in your book, the lengthiest chapter dealing with Ibn Taymiyya, on page 124.
Sure.
Perhaps you could read it out, or I can read it out. It's fine. I can read it out, as I'm sure you remember it.
I have a copy of the book as well.
Oh, you do? Okay, yeah. So let's go to page 124. Why don't you read for our viewers the passage?
Well, I can silently read along, but you should.
Okay, yeah. I'll read it. I'll read it, and you can silently read along. On page 124, you write, since Ali defeated Muawiyah, Ibn Taymiyyah...
Never defeated Muawiyah.
Oh yeah, since Ali never defeated Muawiyah, yes. Ibn Taymiyyah considers Ali to have been forsaken, makhdhūl, by God and the most respected members of the Muslim community. Since Muawiyah went on to establish a dynasty with an army that led successful conquests against non-Muslims, it is clear to Ibn Taymiyyah that God gave victory to those who forsook Ali and waged war against him. Wow, that I found is a very interesting passage for a couple of reasons. Reason number one, the terminology makhdhūl reminds us of mafdhūl, right? Makhdhūl, it's kind of almost a play on words there. But talk a little bit about this idea put forward by Ibn Taymiyyah, right? That Ali is makhdhūl, the one that was forsaken, and Muawiyah's victory is a sign that God was with him.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So within the ancient Near East, I would say Muslims and non-Muslims before them had a triumphalist worldview and a triumphalist expectation of their religion and of God and of their empire, that God brings to power those emperors that are ruling over them, that this is their divine right to rule, and God shows his favor by giving them victory in the battlefield. So it's this triumph, right? This triumphalist worldview that when that army won, it's a sign that it was a victory of God and that God had helped them. And so for Ibn Taymiyyah, he's articulating that. And of course, Shi'ism has to deal with tragedy. It has to deal with theodicy because its heroes aren't individuals who are always victorious in the battlefield or politically or so on. And so Shi'ism is like this counter to that type of triumphalism that was common at that time. But, Shi'ism, you could say, has messianic and eschatological narratives in which that triumphalism comes back, right? So it compromises or provides, a consolation prize for those who are not victorious, in the past. They will be victorious in the future, right? And so Ibn Taymiyyah is saying, look, you have this hadith that says, man kuntu mawla fa aliyun mawla, and that God, wala man wala, and wakhdul man khadala, right? It's saying, may God be the friend or the ally of those who come to Imam Ali's aid, and may God forsake the one who forsakes Ali ibn Abi Talib. Ibn Taymiyya wants to argue against the hadith al-Ghadir as a fabricated report. And so in addition to maintaining a triumphalist worldview, which goes hand in hand with supporting this idea that there were these rightly guided caliphs that legitimately came to power, but also that the Umayyads were rightfully there, and that, you know, history went the way that it should. He also wants to argue against the pro-Alid view that those who forsook Ali ibn Abi Talib were forsaken by God, and that instead of Muawiyah being, you know, forsaken by God and being an enemy of God and an enemy of Ali ibn Abi Talib, we can look at history as one in which he is not makhdul but mansur. So Muawiyah is mansur and Ali is makhdul, meaning if you want to see where God is giving his victory, he gave his victory to Muawiyah. Muawiyah is mansur, and we can see this because not only in Muawiyah being victorious against the Hashemids or Ali ibn Abi Talib and his family, and, you know, Hassan who came after him, but he's victorious against the non-believers or those who are not part of the Muslim community, and that has to be a sign as well. And so this goes into how Muslims viewed conquest as a sign of God's favor, and how they view triumphalism and these types of military conflicts as one that support the truth of their religion. And so he's drawing on that. And of course, empires do this, whether we're talking about the early caliphate, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Ottomans, you know, Mongols, what have you. So he's drawing on, you could say, multiple strands of ancient doctrines when he comes to that very polemical conclusion, and that I would say encourages him to then be critical of Ali ibn Abi Talib and Hussein ibn Ali in very surprising ways or shocking ways.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time today. I think it was a wonderful discussion, and I would encourage readers to take a look at the book, because there's a lot that can be gleaned from it about how identities have formed and counter-identities, and particularly understanding our past, especially the formation of Sunnism and Shiism. So thank you, Dr. Husayn, for your time today with the Shia Research Institute, and we hope to have you on in the future again.
Thank you so much for having me. I very much appreciate this opportunity to discuss my work and hear your questions and hear your comments and reflections. I always appreciate it when people reach out stating that they've read something I've written. It's very much validating, and that's how you support scholars, by reading their work and being in conversation with them. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. You're most welcome.